200 feet down, in water so blue it looks like liquid glass, a diver reached out and touched something that should not have been there. It was stone, cut stone, a flat edge, then a right angle, then another flat edge below it. Steps, a staircase, carved into the bedrock of a Missouri sinkhole, descending into a darkness far beneath the deepest point anyone had ever mapped. Nobody built a staircase down here. There is no record of anyone cutting these steps. There is no record of anyone who could have. And yet there they were, edges worn smooth, as if 1,000 feet had once walked down them into a world that no longer exists. The dive team surfaced shaking. Not from the cold, though the water at that depth sits close to 50 degrees year-round. They were shaking because of what the beam of a dive light had just shown them. When they tried to report it, the responses they got were strange. A shrug from the State Survey Office. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. A polite non-answer from the university. A local historian who went quiet on the phone and then, a week later, called back to say he had found nothing, and please stop asking. That silence is the reason we are here today. Because when you start pulling on the thread of who cut steps into a Missouri blue hole, the whole tapestry of what we think we know about this continent begins to come loose. This is not a story about a staircase. The staircase is just the door. What lies on the other side of that door is a question that a growing number of researchers, amateur historians, and ordinary people who simply looked at an old photograph and felt something was wrong have been asking for the better part of a decade. The question is simple, and it is unsettling. What if the history we were handed is not the history that happened? What if someone, at some point, cut the real story out of the record the way those steps were cut into the rock, cleanly, deliberately, and then walked away and let the water rise over it? To understand why a set of underwater steps matters, you first have to understand the place they were found. Missouri sits on top of one of the strangest pieces of geology in North America. Beneath the rolling hills and oak forests of the Ozarks lies a vast honeycomb of limestone and dolomite, dissolved over what geologists call millions of years into a hidden landscape of caves, tunnels, and springs. The state has more than 7,000 recorded caves. It has springs so powerful they push tens of millions of gallons of water to the surface every single day, and scattered across the region are the blue holes. Deep, near vertical shafts of impossibly clear water that open in the ground like eyes staring straight up at the sky. Consider one of them, a place the locals in the southern part of the state call the Grand Gulf, where a cave roof collapsed and left a chasm 3/4 of a mile long with walls rising more than 100 feet, a wound in the earth that swallows an entire creek and carries it underground to a spring miles away. This is not ordinary ground. It is a landscape with a second landscape hidden beneath it, a drowned geography of rooms and corridors and vertical shafts that the surface gives almost no hint of. And it is into exactly this kind of hidden shaft, this kind of blue eye in the ground, that our divers descended. The blue holes are not isolated freaks of geology, they are windows. Each one is an opening into that vast submerged world below, and most of them have never been explored past the first easy reach of an amateur diver, because past that point the water turns hostile and the margin for error disappears. What makes the blue holes different from an ordinary spring is the geometry. They tend to be nearly vertical, sometimes overhanging, a straight drop into cold clarity. From the surface you can often see 40, 50, 60 feet down, the walls falling away beneath you in shelves and ledges, and then the blue deepens to indigo, and the indigo deepens to black, and the eye simply loses the bottom. Divers describe a particular disorientation in these places, a sense of hanging in space with no reference points, the walls too far to touch, and the bottom too deep to see. It is in that in-between zone, past the sunlit shallows and before the killing depths, that the strangest reports come from, because it is there, on the shelves and ledges, at 100, 150, 200 feet, that the divers keep describing edges that are too clean, corners that are too square, and, in one case, a run of steps. The locals have always been afraid of them. Not in the way you are afraid of a steep cliff or a fast river. In an older way, the kind of fear that gets passed down in families and settles into place names. There are springs in the Ozarks that the old settlers refused to swim in. There are pools the native peoples of the region are said to have avoided, or treated with a reverence that the settlers did not understand and did not write down carefully. When you ask why, the answers dissolve into rumour. Something happened there. Someone went down and did not come back. The water is deeper than it has any right to be, and underneath, in the dark, there is something that was made. For most of recorded history, nobody could check. These holes are cold, they are dark, and they are deep. Early divers with primitive equipment would descend a few dozen feet, feel the pressure squeeze in on them, watch the sunlight thin to a bruised blue, and turn back. It was only with modern technical diving, with rebreathers and mixed gas and lights, powerful enough to punch through the gloom, that anyone could go deep enough to see what was actually down there. And when they did, in blue hole after blue hole, in cave system after cave system, they began to report the same uncomfortable thing. The rock down there does not always look natural. There are edges that are too straight, surfaces that are too flat, angles that do not occur when water slowly eats stone. The staircase in our story is the clearest example anyone has described, but it is not the only one. And this is where we have to slow down, because the moment you say the word staircase, two things happen at once. The believers lean forward, and the skeptics roll their eyes and reach for the obvious explanation. So let us give the skeptics their due right at the start, because a story that cannot survive the obvious explanation is not worth your time. The obvious explanation goes like this. Limestone, when it fractures, breaks along bedding planes and joints. These are natural lines of weakness in the rock, laid down when the sediment first formed and stressed over eons by the movement of the earth. When water works along two sets of these joints at right angles to each other, it can carve out blocks, rectangular blocks, stacked, stepped. To an eye that wants to see a staircase, a jointed limestone face at the bottom of a spring can look uncannily like something built. Geologists have a whole vocabulary for these formations. They will tell you, patiently and correctly, that nature builds staircases all the time, that the Giant's Causeway in Ireland looks like a road paved by giants, and was in fact paved by cooling basalt, that the human brain is a pattern-matching machine that sees faces in clouds and cities on Mars. That is the skeptical case, and it is a strong one. Hold on to it, because the researchers who study these sites do not dismiss it. They live inside it. The good ones spend their careers trying to disprove their own discoveries before anyone else can. What they will tell you is that there is a difference, a real and describable difference, between the accidental geometry of fractured stone and the intentional geometry of worked stone. Fractured stone has a logic that runs through the whole rock face. The joints line up. The angles repeat because the same forces made all of them. Worked stone breaks that logic. It imposes a plan that the rock itself would never have chosen, a tool mark cutting across the grain, a tread that stays level while the surrounding beds tilt, a riser that is the same height as the one above it and the one below it, again and again, in a rock that has no reason to fracture into consistent measurements. According to the divers who described the Missouri steps, that is exactly what they saw. Not a jumble of blocks that resembled a staircase from a certain angle in a certain light. A run of treads and risers, consistent in dimension, cut across the natural bedding of the stone rather than along it. And below the lowest step they could safely reach, the shaft continued down into black water, and the steps, they said, continued with it. Listen to how the divers described the moment, because the details matter. They had gone down along the wall of the shaft, checking their gauges, managing the narcosis that begins to fog the mind at those depths, when one of them signalled and pointed his light. At first it read as just another ledge. Then the beam swept across it, and the shapes resolved. A flat surface. Below it, another, set back and down. Below that, another. The divers say they hung there in the water, breathing slow, playing their lights across the formation, and the longer they looked, the less it looked like an accident. The treads were roughly even. The risers were roughly even. The whole run cut down and across the face of the wall at an angle that had nothing to do with the way the surrounding rock was layered. One of them reached out and ran a gloved hand along an edge, and later, on the surface, he kept saying the same thing. It felt cut, not broken. Cut. They did not go lower. They were near the limit of their gas and their nerve, and the dark below the last visible step was absolute, and something about the place, they admitted, had frightened them in a way that had nothing to do with the depth. They ascended slowly, decompressing on the way up, and by the time they broke the surface they had already begun, without quite deciding to keep the location to themselves. This is common, it turns out, among the small community of divers who have seen things like this. They do not rush to publish. They go quiet. They tell one or two people they trust, and they wait to see what those people say. And often what those people say is, "Do not tell anyone else." Why the secrecy? Ask them, and you get a mix of answers. Some are protecting a dangerous site from thrill seekers who would get themselves killed trying to reach it. Some are protecting themselves from ridicule, having watched what happens to anyone who stands up and claims to have found something that does not fit. And some, quietly, are protecting something they cannot name, a feeling that the place did not want to be found, that they had trespassed somewhere they were not meant to be, and that the right response to trespass is to leave, and to say nothing, and to hope the water forgets your face. Now, if you accept even the possibility that those steps were cut by human hands, you have created a problem so large that most people simply refuse to look at it directly. Because here is the problem. To cut a staircase into solid rock 200 feet down, one of two things has to be true. Either someone dove to that depth and carved stone underwater, in the cold and the dark, with tools we have no record of and for reasons we cannot imagine. Or, and this is the door that opens onto everything else, the staircase was not cut underwater at all. It was cut when that shaft was dry, when a person could walk down those steps in open air into a chamber or a passage that was later flooded, which means the water level in that part of Missouri was once hundreds of feet lower than it is today, or the land itself was hundreds of feet higher, or something happened, something fast and something enormous, that buried a dry, inhabited landscape under water and sediment and left only the tops of its deepest structures visible to anyone brave enough to swim down and look. That word, buried, is where this story leaves the comfortable ground of geology and steps into the theory that has quietly captured the imagination of millions of people around the world. The theory has a name now, though the people who believe it argue endlessly about what to call it and what it really means. Most know it by the name of an empire that appears on old maps and then vanishes from the history books. Tartaria. Before you close this video, before you decide you already know what this is, stay with me. Because the Tartaria question is not, at its heart, a question about a lost empire with a funny name. It is a question about evidence. It is a question about why the world is full of things that do not fit the story we were taught. And whatever you end up believing, the things that do not fit are real. You can go and touch them. Let us start with the maps, because the maps are where the name comes from, and they are not in dispute. For roughly 300 years, from the 1500s through the 1800s, European cartographers, the finest and most careful mapmakers of their age, drew a vast empire across the northern half of Asia and labelled it Tartaria, or Great Tartary. It stretched, on these maps, from the Volga to the Pacific, an expanse of territory larger than any nation that has ever existed. It appears in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. It appears in atlases printed by governments. These were not fringe documents. They were the official knowledge of their time. And then, over the course of a single century, it disappears. Not the land, obviously. The land is still there. What disappears is the name, and the idea that this was a single, coherent civilization rather than a collection of unrelated peoples. By the time the modern history books were written, Tartaria had been dissolved into a footnote. The word was redefined to mean simply a vague European term for a region they did not understand, a label of ignorance rather than a description of a place. The empire that appeared on 3 centuries of maps became, officially, a mistake, a misunderstanding, something that was never really there. The mainstream explanation for this is straightforward and, taken on its own terms, reasonable. Tartaria, historians say, was never an empire at all. It was an exonym, a name outsiders used for a huge and poorly understood region full of many different nomadic and settled peoples, the Tatars chief among them. As Europeans learned more, as the Russian Empire expanded eastward and mapped the territory properly, the vague old label was replaced by accurate names for the many distinct cultures that actually lived there. The empire did not fall. It was never one thing to begin with. It simply came into focus. That is the answer you will get from any university, and for a great many people it is a perfectly satisfying answer. But the researchers who kept pulling the thread noticed something. The disappearance of Tartaria from the record lines up, in time, with a whole cluster of other disappearances, other resets, other moments where the official story seems to paper over something it does not want examined. And once you start noticing that pattern, the maps stop being the strangest thing. The buildings become the strangest thing. Look at the photographs of any major American city from the 1800s. Really look at them. Look at the architecture, the domes, the spires, the intricate stonework, the columns, the vast arched interiors filled with light. Look at the cathedrals rising in cities that, according to the standard history, were muddy frontier settlements a few decades old, built by a population that was small, poor, and overwhelmingly occupied with the daily work of survival. Look at the world's fairs, the great expositions, where entire cities of gleaming white palaces appeared, we are told, in a matter of months. Domed halls larger than anything we build today. Fountains and boulevards and buildings of breathtaking scale and beauty, all of it, according to the record, constructed as temporary plaster and then torn down and thrown away. This is the observation that pulls ordinary people into the Tartaria question. Not the maps, the buildings. The feeling, when you look at those old photographs, that the story does not add up. That the people we are told built these things, with the tools we are told they had, in the time we are told they had, could not have done it. And the deeper feeling, harder to put into words, that these buildings do not look like they were built by the culture that supposedly built them. They look inherited. They look like they were already there. Nowhere is that feeling stronger than when you look at the star forts. Scattered across the entire globe, from Europe to the Americas to Asia and Africa, are hundreds upon hundreds of fortifications built to the same extraordinary design. A geometric star, points radiating outward, walls angled with a precision that looks almost mathematical, sometimes layered in rings of stars within stars. The mainstream explanation is well established and, on its own terms, sound. These are Tres Italienne fortifications, developed in Renaissance Europe as a response to the cannon. The angled bastions eliminate the blind spots that a besieger could exploit and let defenders cover every approach with crossfire. It is brilliant military engineering, and it spread across the world with European colonial power. That is the textbook answer, and it explains a great deal. But the Tartaria researchers look at the sheer number of these structures, their global uniformity, the identical geometry appearing in places that supposedly had no contact with one another, and the strange fact that so many of them seem far larger and more elaborate than any local military need could justify, and they ask a different question. What if the star forts were not forts at all? What if the star geometry was functional in some way we no longer understand, tuned to the same atmospheric energy the theory says powered the old world, and the military story was grafted on later to explain structures whose real purpose had been forgotten or hidden? Once again, you can feel how the argument works. It takes a real and genuinely striking global pattern, the undeniable worldwide spread of an identical and beautiful design, and it pours mystery into the gap between how strange the pattern looks and how mundane the official explanation feels. And then there are the fairs. The great expositions of the late 1800s and early 1900s are, for many people, the single most persuasive piece of the whole puzzle. Take the one held in Chicago in 1893, remembered as the White City. In the space of a couple of years, on marshy ground beside a lake, there rose a vision out of a dream. Vast neoclassical palaces, domes and colonnades and grand basins, a city of gleaming white buildings laid out with a beauty and coherence that visitors described in almost religious terms. Millions came. They walked through halls larger than cathedrals, under electric light, past fountains and sculpture and architecture that seemed to belong to some greater and older civilization. And then, when the fair was over, almost all of it was demolished, torn down and hauled away. The official account is clear and documented. The buildings were never meant to last. They were built of a temporary material, staff, a mix of plaster and fibre over wood and steel frames, designed to look like marble for a single season and then be discarded. There are construction photographs, architects' names, company records, the whole paper trail of an enormous but ordinary building project. But stand in front of the photographs of the White City and try to make yourself believe that all of it was disposable stage scenery, and a part of you resists. It looks too real. It looks too permanent. It looks, the believers say, like it was already there, and the fair was the story invented to explain the taking down of it, the dismantling of a piece of the old world in plain sight, filed under celebration. The revisionist argument, the economic heart of the whole Tartaria theory, goes something like this. There was, not so long ago, a global civilization, advanced, unified, and technologically sophisticated in ways we have forgotten or been made to forget. It built the grand architecture that we now attribute to the Victorians and the classical revival. It laid out cities on principles we no longer understand. It may have harnessed a form of energy, drawn from the atmosphere or the earth itself, that was clean, abundant, and free, which is precisely why, the theory holds, it was suppressed. And then, at some point in the 1800s or thereabouts, that civilization was ended, not slowly, suddenly, through some combination of catastrophe and, the darker versions insist, deliberate action. Its buildings were repurposed. Its history was rewritten. Its population was, in many places, wiped out or scattered. And a new story was installed over the ruins, a story in which the old world was primitive and the new arrivals built everything from scratch. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. The economic dimension is the part that most people miss, and it is the part that matters most for our story, so let us be precise about it. The claim is not merely that history was rewritten for vanity or confusion. The claim is that history was rewritten for profit and for control. Consider what it means, economically, to inherit a fully built civilization and then convince the world that you built it. You get to sell it. You get to mortgage it. You get to charge rent on infrastructure you did not pay to construct. You get to write yourself into the position of creator and owner of everything, and you get to erase the previous owners so thoroughly that no one will ever show up with a competing claim. In this reading, the rewriting of history was not an accident of scholarship. It was the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the species. A whole world quietly reassigned to new management, with the receipts burned. And the free energy piece is the key that locks it together. Look, the theory says, at the buildings themselves. Look at the spires, the domes, the copper, the strange antenna-like ornamentation on top of structures we are told were purely decorative. Look at the cast iron and the specific metals. What if those were not decorations at all? What if the old architecture was functional in a way we no longer recognize, tuned to gather and distribute a form of power that made fuel and labor and debt largely unnecessary? A civilization with free energy is a civilization that cannot be easily controlled, because you cannot charge people for what they can pull out of the air. So the theory holds that the energy was removed, the knowledge was buried, and a new economic order was built on scarcity, on fossil fuel, on debt, precisely because scarcity is profitable and abundance is not. It is worth slowing down on this economic logic, because it is the part of the theory that even skeptical people sometimes find they cannot fully shake. Every economy runs on scarcity. Value, in the way we measure it, comes from things being limited. Now, imagine a technology that made the most fundamental input of the modern economy, energy, effectively free and unlimited. It would be, from the point of view of anyone who profits from selling energy, a catastrophe. It would collapse the value of every oil field, every coal mine, every power company, every fortune built on fuel. Whole empires of wealth would evaporate because you cannot meter and sell what falls freely on everyone. The theory argues that this is not a hypothetical. It argues that such a technology existed, that it was recognized by the people who controlled the flow of money as a threat to their entire order, and that it was therefore hunted down, bought up, buried, and erased. And a replacement economy built deliberately on scarcity, on fuel that has to be dug up and burned and paid for, on debt that has to be serviced forever. Whether or not you believe a lost civilization ever had such a technology, the underlying economic insight is uncomfortably sound. Abundance is the enemy of anyone whose wealth depends on scarcity. And history is full of technologies and ideas that were suppressed, delayed, or bought and shelved precisely because they threatened an existing and profitable order. The believers have simply taken that real and documented dynamic and projected it backward onto a civilization we cannot see, and made it the hidden hinge on which the whole modern world supposedly turns. This is the point where a documentary is supposed to tell you that this is nonsense and to move on. And a great many intelligent, well-informed people will tell you exactly that, and they have good reasons, which we will come to, because you deserve to hear them. But sit with the emotional core of the idea for a moment, because that is what has given it such power. Everyone who has ever stood in a train station built in 1890 and then walked outside into a modern city has felt, on some level, that we traded down. That the people who came before us built with a confidence and a beauty and a permanence that we have lost. The Tartaria theory takes that feeling, that quiet grief you feel looking at old buildings, and it gives it a story. It tells you that you are not imagining it, that something really was lost, that the poverty of the modern world, its ugliness and its debt and its endless scramble, is not the natural state of things but the result of a theft. Now bring it back to Missouri, bring it back to the water, because if any of this is true, if there really was a civilization here before the one the history books describe, then it did not exist only in the great cities of Asia and Europe. It was global. It was here. It was in the Ozarks. And when the reset came, whatever it was, it did not leave North America untouched. The believers point to a specific piece of American history that the mainstream treats as a footnote, and they treat as a smoking gun: the mudflood. Walk through the older neighborhoods of almost any American city and you will see it, once someone points it out to you. Buildings whose ground floor windows are half below the current sidewalk. Doors that open onto a foot of dirt. Elaborate first floor architecture that is now a basement, its windows looking out onto the earth. The standard explanation is that cities raise their street levels over time, that they built up roads and utilities and sidewalks and simply buried the lower floors in the process, a slow and well-documented process of urban growth. The Tartaria researchers look at the same buildings and see something else entirely. They see a landscape that was buried, quickly, by a wave of mud and sediment, a flood, not of water, but of earth, the mud flood. The physical trace, they argue, of the catastrophe that ended the old world, still visible in the sunken doorways and buried windows of every old town in the country. And what would a mudflood do to a landscape riddled with caves and springs and deep vertical shafts, like the Ozarks? It would fill them. It would pour sediment and water into every opening in the ground. It would take a dry, inhabited landscape, with structures cut into the living rock, with staircases descending into cool underground chambers where people may have lived and worshipped and stored what mattered to them, and it would drown it. It would leave the tops of the deepest structures just barely reachable by a diver willing to go 200 feet down into cold black water. It would leave, in other words, exactly what those divers say they found. Let us go back to the steps and look at them through this lens. A staircase cut into rock 200 feet down is an absurdity if the water was always there. It is a tragedy if the water came later. Picture it the way the believers do. A dry limestone gorge or a great open sink, warm air moving through it, a stairway carved by skilled hands leading down from the surface into the cool of the earth, into a chamber that stayed the same temperature all year, a natural refuge, a sacred place, a storehouse, a home, and then, in a period of time measured not in centuries but in days or hours, the mud comes, the water rises, The people either flee or they do not. And the staircase, the beautiful worked staircase, goes under and stays under for however long it has been until a diver's light finds it again, and a whole hidden history announces itself in the shape of a single cut step. You feel the pull of it. Everyone does. That is the power of this theory. It takes the loose threads, the maps, the buildings, the sunken doorways, the fear the old settlers had of certain pools of water, and it weaves them into a single story that explains everything and, crucially, that casts you, the viewer, as someone who has been lied to and is finally being told the truth. That is a very compelling place to stand. It is also, and I want to be honest with you because you have come this far, a place worth being careful about. So let us do the thing that most videos in this genre will not do. Let us take the strongest version of the skeptical case and lay it out fully, not to knock the theory down, but because a mystery is only worth your time if it can survive an honest look. If the steps are real and unexplained after you have heard the best counter-argument, then you have a genuine mystery. If they dissolve under the first hard question, you have been entertained but not informed, and you deserve better than that. Start with the maps. The skeptics are right that Tartaria appears on old maps, and they are right about why. Before the interior of Asia was accurately surveyed, European mapmakers filled the enormous blank space with the best label they had, and that label was Tartary, from Tartar, a name for the Turkic and Mongolic peoples of the steppe. It was genuinely a term born of ignorance, a placeholder for a region Europe knew little about. As real exploration and the expansion of the Russian state filled in the details, the placeholder was replaced by real geography. This is not suspicious. It is how knowledge works. The disappearance of Tartary from the maps is the disappearance of a guess, replaced by facts. On this point, the mainstream case is strong, and any honest researcher has to concede it. The buildings are harder because the emotional pull is so strong, but the skeptical answer is detailed and, frankly, well evidenced. The grand architecture of the 1800s was not built by a small, poor frontier population in a matter of weeks. It was built over years and decades by a rapidly industrializing society with access to something genuinely new in human history. Mass-produced materials, steam power, railroads that could move stone and iron across a continent, cast iron and later steel that let builders raise structures that would have been impossible a century earlier, pattern books that let a single architectural style be reproduced in 1,000 towns, and a vast, cheap and often brutally exploited labour force. The world's fairs really were built fast and then torn down, and we have the construction records, the payrolls, the photographs of the scaffolding going up, the names of the architects and the engineers and the companies. The buildings look too good to be true because we, in our own time, have largely stopped building that way, not because we lost some ancient secret, but because tastes changed, labour grew more expensive, and we decided, collectively, that ornament was a waste of money. The sunken doorways, the mud flood evidence, have an explanation too, and it is almost boringly well documented. Cities did raise their streets, deliberately and on the record. Chicago physically jacked up entire blocks of buildings in the 1850s and 60s to install a sewer system and lift the city out of the mud, and there are engravings and newspaper accounts and business ledgers describing the whole extraordinary process. Seattle rebuilt on top of itself after a fire and left an entire underground city of buried storefronts you can tour today. The buried first floors of old buildings are not the trace of a global catastrophe. They are the trace of 100 local decisions to raise a road, fix a drainage problem, or rebuild after a disaster, each one documented, each one mundane. And the steps? The skeptics have an answer there too, and we already heard it. Jointed limestone, right-angle fracture patterns, the pattern-seeking brain, and they will add one more thing, a fair and pointed thing. Where, they will ask, is the staircase? Where is the photograph? The measured survey, the recovered tool, the piece of worked stone brought to the surface and put under a microscope. A mystery that lives entirely in the description of divers who cannot be named at a site that cannot be visited is not evidence. It is a story, and stories, they will remind you, are exactly what the human mind produces when it stares into deep, dark water and feels afraid. That is the skeptical case, laid out as strongly as I can make it. It is a serious case. It deserves respect. And here is the honest situation we are left in. On almost every specific point, the mainstream has a documented, evidenced answer, and the believers have a feeling and a photograph that could be explained more than one way. If you are keeping score on the individual facts, the score is not close. But the believers are not really playing the game of individual facts, and this is the part the skeptics consistently miss. So let us give the theory its strongest ground. The Tartaria question is not fundamentally about whether any single building or map or staircase proves a lost empire. It is about a pattern of feeling and a crisis of trust. It grew, and it keeps growing, because a great many people have looked at the world they live in and concluded that the official story of how we got here does not match the evidence of their own eyes. And whatever you think about lost civilizations, that crisis of trust is real, and it is not stupid, and it is not going away. Think about what the last century actually taught people about official history. We know, as documented fact, that governments have lied about wars. We know that industries have buried research that threatened their profits. We know that whole populations have been erased from the record, that the histories of conquered peoples have been rewritten by their conquerors so thoroughly that we sometimes cannot recover what was lost, that libraries have burned and archives have been purged and inconvenient truths have been quietly filed away for decades. The idea that the powerful rewrite history to serve their interests is not a fringe conspiracy theory. It is one of the most reliably documented facts about human civilization. The Tartaria theory takes that entirely reasonable suspicion and pushes it to its furthest extreme. It says, if they lied about that, and that, and that, then how do you know they did not lie about everything? Some who go furthest down this road even question the calendar itself. There is a fringe within the fringe. An argument that a stretch of centuries in the historical record was invented, phantom years padded into the timeline to account for a past that did not happen as written, so that events we place 1,000 years apart may in truth sit much closer together, and the grand old architecture we assign to distant centuries may be far more recent than we think. Mainstream historians reject this completely, and the documentary and astronomical evidence against it is substantial. But notice what the argument is really doing. It is attacking the timeline itself, the scaffolding on which every other historical fact is hung. Because if you can make people doubt the calendar, you can make them doubt everything, and the underwater staircase becomes not an anomaly to be explained within history, but a piece of evidence that history itself is the thing that needs explaining. That is the real engine of this, not the maps, the distrust. And the underwater staircase in Missouri is so powerful as a symbol precisely because it sits at the exact point where that distrust meets something physical, something in the rock, something you could in principle go and touch. It is the moment where the feeling that we have been lied to stops being a feeling and threatens to become a fact you can put your hand on. So which is it? Are those steps the fractured edge of ordinary limestone, dressed up by frightened divers and a pattern-seeking mind into a monument that was never there? Or are they the top of a staircase that someone, in a world we have been taught to forget, cut into dry rock in the warm open air before the water rose and the story was rewritten over their heads? The honest answer, the one I am not going to pretend away, is that from where we stand right now, we do not know. And the people who tell you they know for certain, in either direction, are telling you more about themselves than about the steps. But let us follow the economic thread a little further, because it is the most interesting part of the whole theory, and the part that gets the least careful attention. Set aside, for a moment, the question of whether Tartaria was a literal empire. Ask instead a narrower and more answerable question. Is it true that the story of who built the modern world and who profited from it has been simplified and cleaned up in ways that serve the winners? Because on that narrower question, the believers and the historians are closer than either would like to admit. The grand infrastructure of the industrial age, the railroads, the canals, the great public buildings, the water systems and the sewers and the bridges, was built overwhelmingly by people whose names were never recorded and whose labor was extracted under conditions ranging from brutal to enslaved. The wealth it generated flowed overwhelmingly to a small number of men whose names are now on the buildings, the universities, the foundations. The official story of this period is genuinely a story of erasure, not the erasure of a mystical lost empire, but the erasure of the real, human, documented builders in favor of the owners. When a Tartaria believer says the history of who built this world was rewritten to hand ownership to people who did not build it, they are, in a distorted and mythologized way, describing something that actually happened. They have the mechanism right. They have simply attached it to the wrong builders. The people who were erased were not an ancient super-civilization. They were the immigrants, the laborers, the enslaved, the poor, whose sweat is in every stone and whose names are in almost none. And here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the mainstream does not come out of this looking as clean as it likes to pretend. Consider the orphan trains, a piece of American history that is real, documented, and almost unknown to the general public. Between the 1850s and the 1920s, an estimated 200,000 children, many of them from the crowded cities of the East, were loaded onto trains and shipped west to be distributed to families across the country. Some found homes. Many were taken as unpaid labor. The record-keeping was, in many cases, appalling. Children's names were changed. Their origins were lost. Their histories were, in a very literal sense, erased. Now, the standard history treats this as a well-meaning, if deeply flawed, charitable movement. The Tartaria researchers look at 200,000 children with erased histories, moving across a landscape of buildings they insist are too grand for their supposed age, in the exact decades of the supposed reset, and they see something far darker. A population being repopulated, a blank slate being written on, the children of a broken world being redistributed, and their memory of it deliberately wiped. I am not telling you that reading is correct. The evidence does not support it as literal fact, and the documented history of the orphan trains, grim as it is a story of poverty and reform and human failure, not of a civilizational reset. But I am telling you why the theory has such a grip. It keeps finding real anomalies, real erasures, real gaps in the record, and real cruelties that the official story glosses over. And every time it finds one, it feels like confirmation. The believer does not need the orphan trains to prove a lost empire. He only needs them to prove that history is not what we were told, that children were moved and renamed and forgotten, that the record was edited. And that much is simply true. From there, the leap to the larger theory feels not like a leap at all, but like a natural next step. This is the pattern, over and over, with the whole Tartaria phenomenon. It builds its cathedral out of real bricks. The maps are real. The strange, beautiful buildings are real. The buried doorways are real. The orphan trains are real. The old fear of certain deep waters is real. The erasure of the true builders of the modern world in favor of its owners is real. Every individual brick is something you can verify. It is the cathedral, the single grand structure the theory assembles out of them, that the evidence cannot support. And yet the bricks are so real, and there are so many of them, that the cathedral feels solid, even when you know that no single load-bearing wall would pass inspection. So, let us return, one final time, to the water, because the staircase is where all of this either becomes real or stays a story, and you have earned a clear-eyed look at it. Somewhere in Missouri, according to the divers, there is a shaft of blue water with steps cut into its wall, descending past 200 feet into a dark that no one has mapped. If that description is accurate, and if those steps are worked rather than fractured, then one of the load-bearing walls of the skeptical case has a crack in it. Because you cannot explain a genuinely worked staircase 200 feet underwater with jointed limestone and a nervous imagination. You have to explain it with a lower water level, or a higher land level, or a catastrophe that buried a dry place. And any of those explanations opens the door, at least a crack, to the possibility that the landscape here was profoundly different, and profoundly recently, than the textbooks allow. That is the whole game, right there, at the bottom of a cold blue hole. Not whether Tartaria was an empire, whether one honest measurement of one set of steps forces the official timeline to bend. And the maddening, essential truth is that nobody has made that measurement in a way the rest of us can check. The steps, if they exist, sit in a place that is genuinely hard and genuinely dangerous to reach. 200 feet of cold fresh water is a serious dive that has killed experienced people. The state has little interest in funding an expedition to survey a formation that its geologists are already confident is natural. The universities have careers to protect and no appetite for a subject that has become a punchline. And so the steps sit there in the dark, unmeasured, and the mystery persists, not because anyone is necessarily hiding it, but because the truth is expensive and dangerous to reach, and no one with the means has decided it is worth the cost. That, in the end, may be the most honest and the most unsettling conclusion of all. Not that there is a grand conspiracy of scholars and governments guarding a terrible secret. Something quieter, and in its way more troubling. That the tools to answer the question exist, that a proper survey of that shaft could be done, that the steps could be measured and photographed and settled one way or the other, and that it simply has not happened, because the people who could do it have decided in advance that they already know the answer. The believers have decided they know. The skeptics have decided they know. And the one thing that could actually tell us, the rock itself, sits 200 feet down in the blue, patient, silent, keeping its own counsel while the argument rages harmlessly on the surface far above. Here is what I keep coming back to. The old settlers were afraid of these waters. They did not have a theory of lost civilizations. They did not have maps of Tartaria or photographs of world's fairs or the orphan train records. They just had the water, and something in them said stay away. We tend to dismiss that kind of old fear as superstition, and often it is. But sometimes old fears are memory in disguise. Sometimes a people avoids a place for so long that they forget why, and all that survives is the avoidance itself, a warning worn as smooth and anonymous as a stone step, its original meaning cut away, leaving only the shape of a caution passed hand to hand down the generations. Something happened here. We do not remember what. Stay away from the deep blue water. Maybe the steps are limestone. Maybe every strange building has an invoice, and every sunken doorway has a city ordinance behind it, and every erased child has a sad, ordinary explanation, and the whole vast structure of the theory is a cathedral of coincidences that our pattern-hungry minds have talked ourselves into. That is, if I am being straight with you, where the weight of the documented evidence actually sits. On the specifics, the mainstream wins most of the arguments, and it wins them with receipts. But the deeper thing the theory is reaching for does not go away just because its specifics fall apart. The deeper thing is a question, and it is a good question. Maybe the only question that really matters when you look at the past. How much of what we have been told is true? Who decided which version of the story would be written down and which would be left to drown? Whose history got carved in stone, and whose got buried in mud, and who profited from the difference? Those questions are not conspiracy. They are the actual, difficult, humbling work of history itself, and the underwater staircase, real or imagined, worked or fractured, is a perfect symbol for them. A thing that may or may not be there, at a depth that is genuinely hard to reach, that would change everything if we could only bring ourselves to go down and look honestly, with our minds open and our certainty left up on the surface where it cannot get us killed. So the next time you stand in front of a building that seems too beautiful for the world that supposedly built it, or you notice a doorway sunk a foot below the sidewalk, or you read a place name that carries an old warning nobody can explain anymore, let yourself feel the strangeness. Do not rush to the comfortable answer, and do not rush to the thrilling one either. Just sit in the question, because the past is a blue hole. It looks clear and shallow from the surface, and the deeper you go, the darker and stranger it gets. And there are steps down there, cut by someone, going somewhere, and we have barely begun to descend. Whether they were cut by a lost civilization or by the slow, blind hand of water-working stone, they lead, either way, to the same place. Down, into the dark, into everything we have chosen not to know. And that staircase, whatever it is still waiting. 200 feet down, in water so blue it looks like liquid glass. For someone, someday, with a steady light and no certainty left to lose, to finally follow it all the way to the bottom.